So we're going to be transitioning this afternoon into a Tier 2 dialogue. And what I was going to be doing was just setting some context around the conversation that we hope to have this afternoon. Ultimately, we had some discussion this morning about kind of the role and the functioning of the First Nations Fisheries Council. And one of the things that we were pointing to, if you picked out, for those of you from government that just walked in, if you got your swag bag, in there's the First Nations Fisheries Action Plan. And on page 6, it talks about the vision, and it talks about working together and the need for First Nations to work together, and also for First Nations to work with government to help advance our interests in the protection, restoration of ecosystems and salmon. So our objective, of course, is to continue that dialogue, to work productively in collaboration, and for us to be working hand in hand with those that share common objectives. You know, the Fisheries Council, we worked with the Pacific Salmon Foundation this last spring in our Pacific Salmon Action Dialogue series. And one of our taglines was, "It's going to take all of us." And we appreciate them having been our partner in that conversation. And this is a continuation of that conversation about the need for us to be working with the federal government, with the provincial government, with all partners to ensure that we move towards our next tagline, which was "Extinction is not an option." And nobody wants to see Pacific salmon go extinct on our watch. And we've seen the slow decline for many decades. And of course, it's concerning to all of us. So our conversation today is really about moving forward in a collaborative dialogue with, you remember the scope and scale of the conversation in the slide that we had this morning, whether we're talking internationally. Rebecca, we were talking this morning, we had an international gathering of Indigenous salmon people in this building a week ago, and we met with people from Russia, Norway, Japan, all Indigenous people from across Canada and the US, Alaska. And we were quite stricken by the similarities in concerns, the similarities in issues, and how much our cultural values were surrounding the same. So we want to keep the conversation high level. We want to keep it productive and moving forward on how do we get to, in our way of speaking, getting to a good place in a good way. And that's our principle and our teaching in our Salish ways. So I just wanted to make sure that people had the context about what we're doing this afternoon. We'll get into some finer conversation and more detailed conversation as the afternoon goes on. We had a bit of a information dump this morning. People were quite intrigued with the conversation, the information we provided. So we look forward to hearing from the Regional Director General, Rebecca Reed, on the department's plans and priorities and things that are of broad concern to the relationship between BC First Nations and Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So I'd like to invite Rebecca to come up and provide her presentation to you. We'll have a bit of question and answer, and I believe we've now also moved into the virtual world. So we're live. And this morning we were in a closed session because we were in Tier 1 dialogue. But now I guess in the virtual world we're live and people are joining us from around the province. So welcome, Rebecca.
budge your computer over a little bit? Thank you very much, Jordan. And hi, everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to meet this afternoon. Tier 2. Does the sound okay? Lift it up. Is that better? I'll just speak up a little bit. This is actually my first opportunity to be in the Musqueam Cultural Center, and so I'm very thrilled to be here. It is a gorgeous building, and thank you very much for the welcome and the opportunity. Also, many thank yous for the lunch. It was excellent, and I greatly appreciated it. So yeah, the question of what to talk about today, I thought that we'd pick out a couple of key issues. There are a number of DFO staff here this afternoon, and I think collectively we can answer questions and have conversations about things. There's a couple other agenda items coming up, I think, that are very, very relevant, and so hopefully we have a great afternoon. So the first item I think it's really important to talk about is the work on renewing relationships and advancing reconciliation. I think it's a question I'm asked very frequently, what do we mean by that, and what progress has the federal government or has DFO made? Clearly we recognize the critical importance of fisheries for First Nations in BC and remain firmly committed to continuing the work of renewing relationships. I don't need to tell you this is a long-term commitment, but I do think we are at a very interesting point in time with the passage of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act and the UN Declaration Action Plan. And so I think be very interested to hear the presentation next on the agenda from colleagues from Department of Justice and DFO talking about the implementation work that's going on. These and other drivers, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, guide our work in Pacific Region, and we know that we can't do that alone. Opportunities to come together as we are today, as well as working through various venues and in the field are essential in order to deliver on our shared priorities. So continue to look forward to working closely with First Nations, the Fnfc, on issues and opportunities related to conservation of aquatic species, habitat, and fisheries. It's a long relationship that we've had. It's something that I value very, very closely and very much appreciate the chance to continue to work collectively. Just a few stats. Government people love stats. Since last year's assembly, we have continued to work to advance treaty and reconciliation negotiations, 45 tables, 106 nations. To date, 8 nations have signed treaties with Canada, 20 have entered into reconciliation agreements. Further, 8 treaty and reconciliation tables are in advanced stages of negotiations, and that is something that we are very keenly aware of and very interested in advancing because the work is so incredibly important towards advancing self-determination in a manner that's consistent with the UN Declaration. I also recognize, however, that we have a long way to go, and there's no question about that. DFO, we need to continue to build on our national and regional reconciliation strategy, working on cultural change within the department, continue to do our part to eliminate all forms of systemic racism. We're proud of the work that we've done in this regard and have a few examples, which I'd like to highlight. Strengthening public service institutions initiative MOU with the First Nations Public Service Secretariat, and our active participation in the Indigenous Intern Leadership Program, delivered jointly by the BC Assembly of First Nations, the Business Council of BC, and Vancouver Island University. So a couple of examples, but no question, there's a lot more work to be done. So moving on, so Sarah Murdoch is here, who will be part of a panel, and so she is has a lead role in the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, so I don't want to steal your materials, Sarah. But I couldn't stand up here and not talk about salmon as one of our key shared priorities. So the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, we call it PSSI, represents the largest ever federal investment in efforts to save Pacific salmon. And, you know, I really, thinking about Jordan's comments about, you know, the state that this population, this species is at, is we need to do everything we can. And I think that the PSSI is an important step forward to put in concrete measures to make some changes that we need to do. So the plan, which has begun, is to undertake a strategic and coordinated long-term response rooted in collaborative action to stabilize and restore Pacific salmon for the ecosystems, the people, and communities that depend on them. And addressing the significant declines that we've seen is going to take cooperative effort. We are actively engaged in discussions with a number of First Nations across the province to advance fishery transformation initiatives through funding, investments in fishery monitoring, exploring new or innovative harvest opportunities, and capacity development. And more is planned for the next year and beyond. One thing Sarah may talk about further, which I think is really important, is that we're in the process of establishing a habitat restoration center of expertise, which will bring much needed technical capacity to bolster support for habitat restoration efforts. The PSSI Secretariat, which is intended to help us better integrate our work internally, has been established. And so the idea being providing that sort of internal coordination function to make sure all the parts of the region are talking together and coordinated effectively, and then reaching out to First Nations community and partners to make sure that we harness our collective efforts moving forward. It goes without saying, but I want to say that we do view the role, the activity of First Nations and Indigenous organizations as absolutely critical to success. We're currently engaging First Nations organizations such as the Fnfc to identify opportunities for collaborative decision-making, design, and delivery at various scales. There will be continued engagement on PSSI as a whole, as well as direct engagement on the various specific activities. Various PSSI key activity engagement leads will be reaching out to First Nations, and so if your phone starts ringing and there's a little PSSI tagline, make sure you answer. I'm confident that our work in this area will make progress, will bear, I think, benefits in terms of new and better ways for all of us to work together on important priorities. And so it's something that I'm very, very excited about, really feel positive about. And I know that, as I already said, there's a panel this afternoon, so I look forward to that conversation as well. Oh, it's in my slides. Did I skip a slide? Oh, I'm just so far ahead of myself here. Just a second on the BC Salmon Restoration Innovation Fund, BC SHRIF. So hopefully all of you are aware that August 2022, our minister and her provincial counterpart, the Honourable Josie Osborne, jointly announced the doubling of funding contributions for the BC SHRIF, for the BC Salmon Restoration Innovation Fund, and the extension of the program to 2026. There is an application process open right now until November 15th, so there's still time to apply. The new federal and provincial investments will support a range of projects to restore salmon ecosystems, continue to support innovation in community hatcheries, provide sustainable, resilient, and prosperous fisheries. More specifically, this second phase of the BC SHRIF will consider projects that address climate change, impacts to salmon, priority salmon populations, Indigenous participation, and traditional knowledge. The BC SHRIF is very important. It's a key component to the PSSI, and will support the vision of working together to conserve and restore Pacific salmon habitat and populations. I know that people have questions about sort of, how much money is going towards direct projects, how much money is going towards coordination and governance, and I think that this SHRIF is a great and very tangible way to put money where we need it into the communities, into the ecosystems. To date, 97 projects have received BC SHRIF funding, which represents the full utilization of the first phase. And we take great pride in our results to date with $48 million in investments to Indigenous recipients, that approximately 64% of projects funded to date under BC SHRIF are either Indigenous-led or Indigenous partnerships. Now I think I can move to the next slide. Yep. So Big Bar landslide, something that we have been extremely anxious about for a few years and continues to be top of mind for the department. We have had really encouraging news there this year. We continue to work with First Nations and the province through a joint executive steering committee and currently developing options to ensure a long-term solution for FIST passage. So there's a lot more to be said about that, but I know you don't want me talking too much, so I will carry on. Because I think the next topic around climate change and flood recovery, so it's been almost a year, if you can believe it, from the atmospheric river event that impacted the southwest and interior of the province. And the weather over the past couple months has been remarkable in how good it is and how worrying it is as well. Being a Vancouver girl, I love rain, but it is very, I think, significant, the drought situation that we're in right now, when we think about sort of what happened last year. The differences are remarkable. Salmon and salmon habitat priorities must be considered in the space of recovery from such a large-scale event, and we look forward to continue with First Nations and the government in BC on that. Flood recovery action plans have been developed by government to government to government. Flood response tables established to the Nicola and the Lower Fraser River watersheds, which were severely impacted by the November flooding. And much of the current post-freshet work funded by DFO and being undertaken by partners is focused on fish and fish habitat assessment and monitoring. And we've been working together on the ground to address a range of immediate priorities, such as restoring connectivity to critical tributaries, restoring key infrastructure, and recovering stranded juveniles. And I do want to make a particular note of, the situation that we're all aware of about the stranding of a number of pinks and chums up in the Central Coast, and I think the extreme concerns we have for some of the creeks on Vancouver Island as we continue in this current drought situation, and our concern for our salmon. On aquaculture, this is a priority area where constructive dialogue and ongoing collaboration continues to be critical. We're committed to working with Indigenous communities and the province on a responsible plan to transition from open net pen salmon farming in coastal British Columbia waters. We intend to work together to advance innovation in sustainable aquaculture that progressively reduces or eliminates interactions between salmon open net pens and wild salmon, while also taking into account social, cultural, and economic objectives. I hope you are, or many of you are aware that the department recently launched a discussion framework for BC aquaculture open net pen transition plan in July, and there is a round of consultations and engagement processes underway now. So feedback from those engagement sessions and roundtables are going to be instrumental in development of a final transition plan, which we hope for next spring. There has been funding made available for First Nations and Indigenous organizations to ensure they can participate in the process. So far, we've committed around $1 million for Indigenous groups to engage in a manner that supports the communities. The transition plan will build on actions we've already taken. So there are in place already new tools and enhanced management activities, stricter license conditions, and a piloting of area-based aquaculture management. and we will continue to work with First Nations, the province, industry, and other key partners to make the West Coast a world leader in ecologically sustainable aquaculture. And we continue to look forward to continuing to work and collaborate with Indigenous communities across BC on this important issue. Oh, I keep skipping ahead here. So just a word on marine planning initiatives. So on the oceans front, another key work that's underway is the activities that the department's doing to help deliver the Government of Canada's commitments to conserve 25% of Canada's marine and coastal areas by 2025 and working towards 30% by 2030. And that work involves designating new Oceans Act marine protected areas and other effective area-based measures. So to date, we have 14 marine protected areas under the Oceans Act, 3 national marine conservation areas, 1 national wildlife area, 59 marine refuges, which collectively protects 13.81% of Canada's marine and coastal areas. So with respect to the Northern Shelf bioregion, Canada is partnering with 17 First Nations and the province of BC in a planning process to develop an action plan for marine protected area network. The partners are actively engaging the public and stakeholders for input on a draft network action plan. Canada and BC are working together to consult First Nations at the same time to better understand Indigenous interests in the proposed network and to address the action plan, and address them as the action plan is completed and sites are implemented over time. So this is another big project for us this fall. It's taken a lot of time, our time and your time as well, as we go out and talk to folk about this very important process. Just with regards to the southern BC marine spatial planning process, so that is at an earlier stage. It's a big project, it's complex. So we're at the early planning or information gathering phase, which will help build a foundation to inform future planning. But it's going to take, it's going to take a lot of collaborative work. And we are working to advance trilateral collaborations in this area. Recently signed a letter of understanding with DFO, the First Nations Fishery Council and Province of BC, to guide trilateral work in early planning phases. So just a word on the Pacific Salmon Treaty. Clearly, the Pacific salmon are highly migratory, and for that reason, cooperation at an international scale is critical. We have a Pacific Salmon Commission that was established under the Pacific Salmon Treaty to enable cooperation between Canada and the United States in the management, research, and enhancement of Pacific salmon. And this is a big part of a lot of people's jobs, mine included. The role of First Nations in bilateral panels and technical committees that support the treaty and the Commission is absolutely key to Canada's involvement, and we really couldn't proceed without the support of our First Nation participants. We appreciate and thank First Nations representatives, including Commissioners Marie Ned and Russ Jones, for their contribution. And we will continue to work closely with First Nations, including with the Fnfc, to identify candidates for future commissioner, panel, and committee opportunities. While we work towards implementation of the current treaty, we're also thinking forward to the renegotiation of the chapters, which occurs every 10 years. And so we are also, while we're implementing the current chapter provisions, actively developing strategies for renewal of Pacific Salmon Treaty in advance of the 2028 renewal period. So it takes a lot of thinking and collaboration to make sure we know what we want as a country and as governments in advancing this treaty. So in conclusion, there is a lot of priorities on the go right now, lots of complexity. I would be the first to say that sometimes the work seems to go slowly, particularly true when it comes to the work of reconciliation. I would say, though, it really is about the people and about making the relationships right. And so I just want to to close on showing you these pictures, which to me I think are some really powerful reflections of our attempts to work collaboratively, reconciliation, and action. So I'm just going to do a little time check because I saw you looking at your watch. Do you want me to stop or? Okay. And just maybe just to show you talk about the pictures then. So the first one, the top, it says top right, but I think that's top left. Anyway, the Sharing Science at Sea Indigenous Engagement Expedition. So there was a 10-day DFO Canadian Coast Guard expedition that visited 5 communities in BC's Central Coast, including the Haisla, the Gitga'at, Kitasoo, Hiltsik, and Nuhawk Nation. Community members were invited for open houses aboard a Canadian Coast Guard vessel to meet the captain and view demonstrations of DFO science and Canadian Coast Guard's search and rescue work happening in their territories. And I will say, with COVID and complexities, I was so incredibly grateful that this actually happened this year. It was, I think, hugely positive. It also included a shore program for kids, educational activities, hands-on science, and just really nice to have something so positive. I wanted to show you the picture in the top right-hand side. I'm confused by why it's backwards, but so this is a picture of my office, 401 Burrard. And last month, the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy Team of Reconciliation Partnership Branch that David Didluck is leading was inspired to engage DFO staff in creating a powerful window display at DFO Regional Headquarters, downtown Vancouver, for the September 30th National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So DFO staff covered the lobby windows with dozens of orange shirts and hearts with the intention of reminding both staff and public viewers of this important day and to honor and commemorate the many children and adults across Canada who never returned home from residential schools. So this was part of it, but it plastered all of our windows, and I just want to say how much I appreciate my staff doing that, and I hope for the citizens of Vancouver that walked by and for others, it was a powerful reminder of these important issues. And then finally, on the bottom photo, this summer, this is a photo of the Pulling Together canoe journey. DFO staff from Pacific Maritimes and National Headquarters attended the 20th anniversary of the Pulling Together canoe journey, hosted by Splatson, Adams Lake, Swimp, and Canham Lake First Nation. So DFO has participated in this Pulling Together canoe journey since 2008, and this year supplied 2 canoes for the journey. On and off the canoes, DFO immersed themselves in the culture of the Secwepemc people and fostered new and lasting relationships with community members and other participants. And so I think that this is something that's, for DFO staff, something that's fiercely fought over. People really want to participate and do this. It's incredibly powerful and impactful activity to do, and so it's something that people view very, very positively. So finally, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to speak. I appreciate a chance to share a bit with you and understand we may still have a few minutes for questions.
I'll give you my comfy chair. Okay, thanks, Rebecca. That was really good. And I'm just going to say, for those of you that probably don't understand the impact that Reconciliation Day has, as a child of a survivor, when I flew home to Canada and Air Canada started the flight with "We recognize," it brought tears to my eyes, and it really was emotional. So anything that you've done in honor of our survivors is impactful to those that are the children of those survivors. So, and I would imagine the survivors themselves. So I want to thank you just to acknowledge that, because you don't know what the impact is that you're having. So that we have a mic right here in the center. I'm going to ask you to use that because we are live streaming. So if you want to come up to ask your questions of Rebecca, and then I'll moderate the session. and we'll do about a 15-minute question and answer, but you're only going to get there if you stand in front of that mic. And I then ask you to be respectful of everybody else that wants to ask questions. Keep your questions short, to the point, and I will determine whether she's answering them all at once or individually.
Thank you. My name is Eva Clayton. I'm the president for the Nisga'a Nation. I want to thank you for your presentation on the plan of action for DFO Canada. I'm very interested in the collaboration and action plan and how that will be rolled out, because the Nisga'a Nation is very much interested in renewing relationships. We're interested in the National Reconciliation Plan, the strategy that's going to roll out. We're also very much interested in the Indigenous programs, as well as the Pacific Reconciliation, the Fisheries Act amendments, strengthening public service institutions. My question is, how will this be rolled out to the modern-day treaties? Because I understand all of this is happening for the Indigenous people, but I think it's equally as important for the modern-day treaties to have all of this as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva.
So thank you very much for that question, and it's very nice to see you. No question about the importance of the Nisga'a Treaty and the important relationships that we have with the Nisga'a people. I think it's a great question to say, what about existing treaties and what about the future as far as the programs and initiatives as we evolve and work towards this reconciliation. And I think from the legislative and policy review, we'll hear from colleagues after I sit down about some of the specifics of how that review is going on. But the programs that we are rolling out now that are generally available, I think, is another opportunity for, well, treaty and non-treaty groups. I also think, though, that how we approach issues and how we solve problems is, I hope that you would agree, is changing and has to continue to change, fundamentally change, so that we are collaboratively working together on problems and solutions. And it really is kind of as much a style issue and a philosophy issue as it is, whether it's this program or that program. So I think it's a combination of responses from a policy, legislative, program delivery, but also sort of cultural and approach to how we sort of implement our commitments to reconciliation.
Thanks, Rebecca. I just ask you to introduce yourself as you approach the mic as well.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Bruce Haldane. I'm a Deputy Chief Councillor for the community of Nisga'a. I have a couple of questions. One is, you talk about collaboration. When making a decision, DFO makes a decision on issues, do you collaborate with the nations that it's going to involve? I feel that's very important. I know when decisions are made at the mouth of the river, all of a sudden we hear it's going to be an opening. Nothing, they never talk to us. And the other one is a moratorium on all spawning grounds, spawning creeks. We have people that are fishing right on the spawning ground, right at the mouth of the spawning ground. Not just in our nation, quite a few other places. So could we have a moratorium, a mile river from all spawning ground? Even sport fishermen are right at the mouth of the spawning ground. And that's a really big concern to us. Thank you.
So, well, thank you for those two, I think, very important questions. I mean, on the question about sort of collaboration and involvement in decision-making as it pertains to, you know, impacting on a First Nations rights, we do absolutely make every attempt to involve the right nations on any management decision that's taken. And so our consultation process, we try very hard to be inclusive and to include the right groups on the right topics. And so if there are some gaps, I think that's important to point them out so that we can look at our consultation process and make improvements. On the issue of the impacts on spawning grounds, I mean, no question we need to protect stocks of concern and spawning fish. I know that there have been a few examples this summer, unfortunately, where you know, less than well, some fishing practices took place that were less than satisfactory, and there was you know, enforcement actions taken as a result. So I don't know. I mean, I think the idea around protecting fish is paramount. The tools that we use, I think, will depend on the river and the system, but there's no question that we do need to protect our salmon and particularly those spawning populations.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Good afternoon. Thanks for your report. My name's Eric Clayton. I'm from the Nisga'a Nation as well. And as you can see, we do have a number of concerns in regards to the Nass River. My primary concern is, why does the Department of Fisheries and Oceans funding programs for our neighbor groups to conduct surveys and studies replicating what the Nisga'a Nation's already been doing for well over 20 years? And we've actually won awards for the stuff that we've been doing on the Nass River in terms of restoration and whatnot. And I find it in bad taste that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is giving these people a false hope that they have some kind of asserted rights in our territory, when in fact they did lose a Supreme Court case not once, not twice, but 3 times in terms of their asserted rights over resources in the Nass. And we would like to see it stop, to tell you the truth. I'm not here to bawl you out, but we're telling you the problems that we have. And my colleague there mentioned it earlier. We have people taking fish out at will at the spawning ground. And I mentioned it earlier this morning, I would like to see a moratorium on the spawning grounds of not just our river, but all the rivers. Because if you go up to the Midian, you have a settlement of non-native people living there that continuously sport fish there. They actually have what they call the rod days up there. And we would like to see that, because they are spawning grounds. And I thank you for your time, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Want me to respond? Well, thank you. It's nice to see and hear from so many Nisga'a representatives today. That's excellent. We do have, I think, well, we have a joint technical committee with the Nisga'a, which is incredibly important to how the treaty is implemented, and so that goes without saying. But I think the point around, well, what about the neighbors? What about other interests is fundamental to DFO. So we do have an obligation to consult and work with all First Nations in the areas where they fish. And so I think that's a great example of, you know, that there's different views about sort of how best to consult and where to conduct programs. But I do think the solution there is a joint planning process where we talk together, DFO with nations who have an interest in a particular area, and we collectively agree on what those programs should look like, so that there is an overlap, so there isn't kind of, you know, duplication, but that there's kind of a greater richness to be able to collect more information, more data about the populations that we really care about.
Thanks, Rebecca. Jordan, if I can get you to go to the mic, for those that are streaming, they'd like to see your lovely face as well.
Is Jordan allowed to ask questions? Wait a minute.
Now I'm going to ask you a question with
no.
my lovely face.
I'm putting my glasses on now.
This is just something that is completely off topic, because it wasn't even your plans and priorities, but I know it's a long-standing priority issue to BC First Nations. And it seems to be without proper leadership nationally. And that is the Guardian program. I've seen many First Nations take stops and starts to try and get a Guardian initiative moving forward. I know that a friend of mine is actually doing a series, Steve Sweetholt is doing, he calls them Ocean Warriors. And I know it's on Aboriginal People's TV. And I know that there are the Coastal Guardian Watchmen initiatives. The national approach originally for the Guardian program was to provide First Nations with jurisdiction and authority to do work in collaboration with CNP, Conservation and Protection Officers. The program, and I've contributed to the program at the national scale through the Collaborative Program Management Committee, and looked at the Guardian program. And for a lot of reasons, we seem to be spinning our wheels in rolling something out. I know that it's something that, like I said, is very near and dear to First Nations. I hear it everywhere I go, almost on a weekly basis. What about our Guardians? And some of the Guardians, I know there's probably a couple of remnants or artifacts in the room here. And I was one of those original Guardians where, like, I'm 60 years old now. And so there hasn't been a Guardian program in its form for quite a while. And I mean with jurisdiction and authority. What I'm going to ask you, Rebecca, because I've been approached by Regional Chief of the AFN, Terry Teegee, saying, why don't we do something in BC? Why don't we do a pilot program in BC? We've got 200 nations in BC out of 630, so that's over 30% of First Nations in Canada. Why don't we begin to do some type of pilot in British Columbia that starts to get the ball rolling? Because we're going to do our part to try and pressure Ottawa to get the Guardian program, and I've already been on a number of conference calls and Zoom meetings with people back east. But I want to explore the concept with you and your plans and priorities, the need for a refresh or a reboot of some type of Guardian initiative. Every one of the reconciliation framework agreements or treaty agreements or self-government agreements always envision some type of mechanism, but we have no real vision to lead it anywhere in a meaningful way. So my question to you is, would you be open to exploring that conversation with the Fisheries Council to see if we can kind of explore a refresh of a Pacific region Guardian initiative? That's my question to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Jordan. Well, it's a great point, a topic. Obviously, we don't have enough time at this point to talk about it, but I would like to offer, I mean, I completely agree with you. So my, I think, kind of first introduction to the Guardian program way back in 1992, I thought we made, some great initial steps. And then I would like to invoke the name of Bob Warren, who provided an extremely important leadership role in advancing kind of the Guardian program in this region. And it has been my strong view that without that kind of individual leadership supported by the willing, it's really hard to make progress. And I know that we have some kind of structural issues related to sort of the issues around authority and designations, and that we have made some recent progress, positive progress. this year. And so there is work going on, and I think people are taking it seriously. And I know that you're aware of that already. But I would be very interested in a conversation about how do we generate that leadership and that kind of focus in order to make concrete progress. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about. So our next meeting, we can do that.
All right. I have 2 more speakers, and then I'm going to release Rebecca from the stage because she's been up here for quite a while. So Robert, and then the final Niska speaker.
Yeah, Wade Chukwinuk, Robert Phillips with the First Nations Summit. So it's very difficult to come up here because every time I talk to First Nations, the relationship with DFO is not on the best of terms. And a lot of times in regards to the work we do here in British Columbia, I do agree because the First Nations Fisheries Council is trying their best in the strategy, and especially the next number of years. And just looking at the action plan about relationships and reconciliation, aquatic resource sharing, allocation, safeguarding habitat and responding to threats, aquatic resource management, building solid economic opportunities, and negotiations and litigation. And so it does really come down to jurisdiction and authority. You can give us some examples of co-management that might be of help. I know that there are some plans and discussions around that. Cooperative management, of course. And then we see in treaties, we see certain amount of jurisdiction, but of course we hit the wall a number of years ago, as you know, in negotiations for modern treaties. So I think when it gets down, especially to the Aboriginal rights and title, and all the court cases that were alluded to this morning, and I think the path is there, but we're going to have to really get down to that discussions and negotiations. And it has to be a lot more than just the collaboration. Because sometimes we meet with the DFO minister, good things are said, but we're not seeing the next steps that has to happen. So I know there's a lot more that needs to be said, and I know you're just one of the people that will take the messages back, but I really do believe we have to do that, and the strategy and communication is very much necessary. So, I don't want to attack mode, I want to bring out solutions. And there's been a lot of reports in the last 10, 20 years. And, I do believe that we need to start implementing those reports. And so the work that's coming out of here, we need to start implementing with DFO. So I just want to say a few things, keep it, of course, very positive, and so that we can sit down and have those discussions and then see it happen on the ground and in the rivers. Because what's happening now, it's mismanagement. And we're seeing it with climate change, we're seeing it with the fisheries, we're seeing it with the decimation of our, it just goes on and on and on. So First Nations have certainly been wanting to not only collaborate, but actually implement some of the traditional ways and traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledge. And that needs to happen, and needs to happen, decades ago. So anyway, just thought I'd say a few words. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Robert. All right, my final Niska speaker. Chief, you want to get in too? You're next.
Thank you for your, how do you say it? It wasn't really a report. It was a plan. Like when you read a report, you give numbers. The actual numbers of the returns that are coming to our rivers. Lunchtime, I took a break. I walked over to the river. Like I've fished the whole coast. And I've seen the report for the Nass River. When you have a return of 267,000 and you guys say that's a healthy number, that's a disgusting number. Like our Indigenous people have been managing and looking after our rivers for generations before the European came. Then we're put on reserves. And they decide to think that, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And all of a sudden, our fish are disappearing. The speaker before me hit it right on ahead when he said it was mismanagement. And it's not just mismanagement, it's a gross mismanagement. The Nass River has been losing 33% of its salmon every year. And at that rate, the Nass River is going to run out of salmon in 15 years. So my question to you is, what is it going to take for DFO to listen to the Indigenous people? Like, you look out here, you look at the water flowing. As long as our rivers are flowing, that's our bloodline. And when you guys are going to mismanage what is there, not just for the Indigenous people, but for everybody, that's one hard pill to swallow. I couldn't believe it when I read the report. And I would have appreciated if there was an actual number for what is really going on. Thank you.
Chu, thank you. I'll let Chief Planas speak and then he can respond.
Fnfc, Chief Gordon Planas from South. My traditional name is Hayakwacha. I'm named after my great-grandfather from Chiano, the Salmon people. It's great to talk to you. I just had a couple of things that I'd like to say about our territory. Thing is that for a small nation in Suk, we pronounce it South. We lack capacity. We're not sustainable enough to take care of our fishery. And I can't talk for any of the other nations along the coast, but I think with communications, we find it difficult. For myself personally, I go to a lot of meetings, and it's easy, you could go to one every day. And so having that kind of communications is really vital, and being able to bring over a united voice, because we are the voice for the salmon, and there is so many different concerns in all these different territories. And that just brings to light formal recognition of our territories, because it ain't just the salmon that we're worried about. If it's connected to territory, it's the watersheds. It's the logging practices, it's resource development, all those things that are included. And knowing what's happening in our territory, just to name one, green crab. We've taken over 100,000 green crab in just the last few months. And that's a priority for all of us. It's going to be, all we're doing is trying to keep it under control. And it's really unfortunate that Japanese knotweed in the last while has come down our river. And if we don't get in control of that, that is going to be just terrible for all of the inside the harbor and basin. And when we talk about green crab, they take up the eelgrass. The eelgrass is important for salmon. So the food chain is disrupted. And I think about the work you do. It's very difficult because there's so many nations along this coast on all three oceans. And my biggest concern is the priority to look at the areas that need help, and being able to use that local knowledge to actually engage in that. So again, I think formal recognitions of our territory is important. Number two is communications of how can we get our voices out. And I really commend this table here, because they've been trying to do that and they recognize how difficult it is for us to go out and communicate back. So we are on a path, but we need to get on a path of reconciliation, and that will take it from each nation individually, sending that messages back to you. So I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to bring a few of those comments up. So thank you. Aishka.
Hi, OCM. And I'm going to let Pat have the last. He never ever pushes the boundaries on these meetings. So in the 12 years that I facilitated these, this is your one free one, Pat.
Thanks. I have a question from a Sequebin community member, Greg Witzke. He's asking, what are the key obstacles that DFO believes are keeping them from changing their jurisdiction and authority to empower First Nations? That's from Greg.
Or not even using yours.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Greg, for that question. I mean, the next, I think, discussion, we'll have colleagues from Department of Justice and our national headquarters to talk about sort of the review process that's going on that speaks to that specifically about, why is the Fishery Act written the way it is, and how do we actually make it consistent with the principles and the spirit of the Act. And so I think there's a lot more work to be done. And I mean, it speaks to the last two comments as well about, clearly we are experiencing some very, very significant ecosystem changes, invasive species, population declines. It's extremely troubling. And we have a mandate with First Nations, with Indigenous people, to work together, government to government. And we are in the process of doing that. And I wouldn't say by any means are at the point of declaring victory that we've got it figured out, but it is a process and we need to work on it together. And that's, I think, our commitment to this room and to others, is to continue to work, and be absolutely committed to that work, so that we could advance those shared goals and address and respond to some of the very, I think, fair criticisms that I've heard. So I would say, I'm sure you weren't expecting, don't worry, I've got it figured out. But I do think that what you're hearing is a commitment and recognition of the importance of the topic and the need to make progress. And I guess that's how I would respond to you and to Greg.
Thank you, Rebecca. And on behalf of the First Nations Fisheries Council, Jordan has a token of our appreciation for you today.
Rebecca, without fail, you've always been a faithful public servant to come and put your time in here. The questions are not always easy, but we've always embraced the thought about being tough on the issues, soft on the people, and we appreciate you putting in the time to be here. And we respect you for that, and thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
Move the computer back, lower the mic to the 5-foot height so I can actually even see over top of it. Okay, so we are going to go to our next session, which is a virtual session, and it's Luke McKay, Director of Policy, Integration and Reconciliation, DFO, and then Elizabeth Lowe, probably messed that up, Director of the UN Declaration Act Implementation Secretariat, Department of Justice. And they're going to talk about Crown Reconciliation and Fisheries, overview and update of federal implementation of UNDRIP and DFO's Reconciliation Action Plan. So, without further ado, I think my team can get these people virtually. One's there. Hey, welcome.
Well, can you hear me?
Hear you? Want to do a mic check? Luke?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay. All right, Chimigwich. I think I'll start off the session, so I'll introduce myself and Do wish I was there in person as well. And instead of hiding out here in at my home while my kids get home from school, but I'm really glad to be joining you virtually. Najismikas Elizabeth Logue, and you did pronounce it right. It's Logue as in Vogue or Rogue. So Najismikas Elizabeth Logue. I am Algonquin Irish from, my family's from Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabe First Nation. I am coming to you from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of my people here just outside Ottawa. So really glad to be joining you. And as I was introduced, I am the director of engagement and consultation within the this newly formed Secretariat at Justice on the implementation of the United Nations Declaration Act. So I am just going to kind of go through a little bit of an update. We are working with the First Nations Fishery Council, at least through our call for proposals and to working together, hopefully through the fall and into the spring on a lot of this work. But I'll give an overview, and then also Luke McKay from DFO will talk about the specifics around DFO's work that is linked to the UN Declaration, as well as their reconciliation strategy. So next slide. So I feel like I may not need to go through all of this background on the UN Declaration with those in the room. I did get to listen in on the last couple of questions and have a sense of who's in the room from Nisga'a territory and around. So I will go through a little bit of a background just to contextualize our work within the Secretariat. As you all know, in June 2021, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, the UNDA, Bill C-15 was passed. And Bill C-15 has the three main sections of the act that we are focusing in on within the Secretariat. Thank you. Is section 5, 6, and 7. So you'll hear me refer to these while I'm presenting. Section 5 is the consistency of federal laws with the declaration piece that measures to ensure the consistency with federal law. And our Secretariat's working closely with the Aboriginal Law Center within Justice on that. And I'll talk a little bit about some updates there. Section 6, development of an action plan within 2 years. So we have a deadline of June 2023 to come back with that action plan, and all measures will be identified through consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples. So again, working with the First Nations Fisheries Council, but as well as others within the province of British Columbia, and other territories across the country. So that work is ongoing. Section 7 is annual reporting on progress tabled in Parliament. So we did have a first annual report tabled this June, which was very much more about process and the establishment of what putting in place processes to actually carry out this work in consultation and cooperation. So that's been tabled, and we will continue the work. So next slide. So on the consistency of laws piece, the section 5, as it's stated within the Act, there's a commitment to take all measures necessary to ensure consistency of federal laws with the Declaration. Justice is leading this work, a Privy Council office, and working really with all federal departments on putting in place tools to ensure that consistency. So not just identifying sort of which laws need to become consistent. That work is all part of identifying priorities, but putting in place tools to ensure that consistency with the declaration is done as part of an overall engagement and consultation process. So to date, we've solicited input on what measures could be done, what processes could be put in place to align And so that is ongoing. I can say that we have been meeting with the province of British Columbia as well to figure out some lessons learned and to explore some options there with regard to consistency of laws. So we are talking to officials there, but also talking to national, regional, modern treaty self-governing and others on what that looks like on Section 5. Next slide. For the action plan, as I mentioned, we have that 2-year time frame. We do see some of those elements of consistency of laws that would be potentially captured within the action plan, you know, as a measure within the action plan. But we also, I should have mentioned that with Section 5, it did become live in June 2021. So as soon as Bill C-15 was passed, Section 5 was live, and so work has been ongoing to ensure that consistency with the declaration for anything coming forward to Parliament. For the action plan, that's the work that we're really right in the middle of right now, and I'll talk about that process throughout this presentation. But what I wanted to mention here is that there are pieces that are written into the Act that must be included in the action plans, such as tackling violence and discrimination, promoting understanding of human rights education, ensuring accountability, and monitoring the implementation of the overall plan over time. So those elements are written right into the Act, and so measures need to be identified that address those pieces. Next slide, please. And the action plan also, we've identified some areas that have come out not just through international dialogue, but also through dialogue, consultation, and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, and identified areas where some of those action items might fall within. So self-determination, lands and territory, environment, as you've all been talking about today, I'm sure, linking to those pieces, participation in decision making. So we see, of course, the declaration is coherent and it has, you know, they're all interrelated, but we do see how some of these action items would be falling within some of these areas or thematic areas. Next slide. We also have been talking about not wanting to, recreate anything or duplicate anything, but also not just a cut and paste of what's already out there. So we want to ensure that the action plan is actionable. And so we are building off of current initiatives, but not wanting to just use those as checking off boxes, as we say. So we want to ensure that we're not duplicating. So we are working to ensure that we're working with those who are working on the implementation of the Indigenous languages, the pathway to address missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and Two-Spirit people. So all of the work that has been underway over time that link not just to reconciliation, but that have a linkage back to the United Nations Declaration, we've been taking into consideration and wanting to ensure that the action plan is then built upon that, but not duplicating it. So slide. For Section 7, we are looking at, the annual report, as I talked about, was tabled in June 2022. This report was structured around that rights-based framework that I showed a few slides back, that has the different categories or thematic areas. And then I wanted to just mention that the annual report, the action plan, all of this work is, although it's being led by the Department of Justice, there is a whole of government approach. So Minister Lametti is leading this work on behalf of the whole of government, but obviously working very closely with his cabinet colleagues and wanting to ensure that what comes out of Indigenous-led consultation gets reflected into that action plan. So next slide. So the engagement process, as I mentioned, is what we're right in the middle of right now. So we wanted to ensure that it was broad and inclusive and distinctions-based, plus ensuring that there is good engagement. We launched back in December of 2021 a call for proposals, and so there was some funding to work on Indigenous-led consultation. And so there was about 26 million available. We funded about 150 projects, and those are slowly underway. There has been some delays in getting funding out the door, so that was meant a little bit of a delay over the spring and summer to have that Indigenous-led consultation happen. But we're right in the middle of checking back and really sort of setting up that mechanism to ensure that what comes out of the Indigenous-led consultations with your nations or your citizens or your members gets reflected back into the action plan. And we also started discussions with provinces and territories and some industry stakeholders, not for input on the action plan, but just for information sharing and education. So realizing that, you know, they will want to ensure that they are also aligned with the Declaration and the Declaration Act. The action plan that we are developing will be a federal action plan, and so that is something to keep in mind. It's not a national action plan, it's a federal action plan. So there'll be no provincial or regional sort of breakdown within that action plan. It'll be really tied to the federal jurisdiction. Next slide. This is just a sort of a depiction of the engagement that we've been doing. As I mentioned, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, but also Modern Treaty Self-Governing and others. We're wanting to ensure that it's very broad and inclusive. I think during the Bill C-15, there was some feedback from that process that there needed to be much more outreach on this process and what implementation of the UN Declaration Act looks like. And so our outreach has been really broad and wanting to ensure that those voices get brought forward for the action plan. Next slide. The timeline is something that I only touched on briefly, but it is definitely front of our minds and our hearts. It's a 2-year time frame, and so we are now into the fall of 2022. And as you see here, we and I mentioned the call for proposals. There was a bit of delay getting the funding out the door. We had hoped to get some initial sort of feedback and priority listing from Indigenous peoples from across all territories by the fall. So given the delays, we've been looking at ensuring that that work continues over the fall, and that we would be looking at releasing a what we learned report and a draft action plan in the early spring, late winter of 2023, so that we have a bit of time there from that time till June 2023 to then have a validation period and finalize the action plan together. So that's our timeline. It's been quite a crunch timeline, as you can see with that 2 years. We really did just launch, not in June 2021. We had a federal election there in the fall, and so it really was a bit of a delayed start, but we're hoping to sort of make up some of that time in the sense of allowing for additional time for Indigenous-led consultation and priority setting, and then bring that forward to the spring. And then tabling that final action plan in June 2023. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the implementation is a whole of government. We've been working, we have set up some bilateral tables and dialogues with not just national Indigenous organizations, but regionally as well, PTOs and modern treaty self-governing. And on the federal government side, we've been dialoguing with lead departments. So as I mentioned, Minister Lemedi is leading this on behalf of the whole of government, but it will be a whole of government action plan. And so we've set up assistant deputy minister, senior level committees, all the way down to sort of director level committees to ensure that there's a knowledge of the work. And as priorities are being brought forward by Indigenous partners, those priorities are being shared with lead departments in order to ensure that to work through what that action plan item could look like. And so the process in place is really one of sort of information sharing, that we want to ensure that the consultation and cooperation that's done with Indigenous peoples is then also bringing in the lead departments for the priorities being put forward, so that at the end of the day, that draft action plan and that final action plan can be a reflection of priorities on the ground, but also priorities that lead departments can work with Indigenous partners on. So, and I think, as mentioned in this slide, we see that the Prime Minister had mandated all ministers to implement the UN Declaration and to work in partnership with Indigenous peoples to advance their rights. And so, Minister Lemedi, in leading that, is definitely checking in with cabinet colleagues and all federal departments to ensure that they are working towards that alignment. And I think it's at this stage that I'd call on Luke to talk about the DFO's work.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Just doing a quick audio check here. Hopefully folks can hear me in the room.
Good. You're good.
That is it. Okay, I'll continue on. Thank you. So thanks again for the invitation here. So again, it's Luke McKay from DFO. I'm in the national headquarters region and working closely with Elizabeth at DOJ on the implementation of the UN Declaration from a Fisheries and Oceans Canada perspective. So just wanted to provide a quick update and kind of clarify where we are in the process and where we're going in terms of kind of next steps. So maybe if we could just flip to the next slide, please. So just building on exactly kind of what Elizabeth finished off with, like we essentially, as folks probably know, this is very much a whole of government commitment. And so our minister, our department is of course mandated to implement the declaration. We, as Elizabeth explained, we're working very much in step with Department of Justice, who's leading on the engagement process, to ensure we're of course plugged into whatever is coming out of that process, and can therefore kind of respond appropriately to the recommendations that are coming out of the engagement and the what we heard sort of process. This slide here, very, I recognize it's very much high level in this slide, but what we kind of wanted to reinforce again is that we do feel we do have a foundation within the department to build on, and that's something we recognize. There's definitely more work to be done, but there are a few areas, of course, that we do see some very, I would say, important sort of alignment with the articles in the declaration, be it through the participation in decision making, of course, self-determination, the environment, and the economy to an extent. And so we definitely see ourselves, DFO, very much as playing a significant role in the implementation of the declaration. As folks may know, we do have a reconciliation strategy, which has been in place since 2019. It was essentially a framework or roadmap developed for within the department to move forward on reconciliation and really trying to drive reconciliation across all our core business lines, and stemming from this kind of overarching roadmap, putting in place more tangible actions. And we do see an opportunity to sort of refresh or take another look at our strategy to ensure there is that alignment with the UN Declaration and the actions coming out of the whole of government action plan. So again, a recognition that we do have a foundation, but certainly more work to be done through the consultation and cooperation process. Maybe I'll just switch to the next slide, please. So again, just reinforcing that we are working closely with DOJ, and to clarify the process. So as Elizabeth said, we will, as soon as recommendations we come in or action recommendations, like we are focused on actionable measures and trying to ensure that those are reflected in the whole of government action plan. So just a bit on clarity on the process in terms of how that is shaping up. As soon as we do have a sound understanding of the priorities of Indigenous partners coast to coast across the country, those are being fed into our department, to DFO. In terms of my specific role and my team, we are working across the department to ensure that what we are responding to is reflective of those regional realities. So working closely with our Pacific region colleagues and other regional colleagues across the country. So we will be required to do an assessment of measures, actions, recommendations, and to put those forward through the process, and move forward with commitments that can be implemented, that are actionable in this context. So again, we do want to build off this engagement process that is ongoing, ensure that we are hearing that the priorities that are coming through this process, and then building off those. So maybe just if we can flip to the last slide here, and if we can. I'm not sure if the slide changed, but there we go. Perfect. So, and again, like we do think, of course, the whole of government action plan is a key priority for this government, for all ministers, but we don't want to stop there. And so the message I kind of wanted to make clear here, and I recognize that some of this is more internal facing, but I think there is some importance to it, is that, this has to kind of be, grounded and mainstream through all our work, right? So there's an action plan, a whole of government action plan, which will, sort of elaborate these priorities that we can move forward on in partnership. But there is, more work even to be done beyond that. And so what we are trying to do in step with other federal departments and our Indigenous partners is to really, roll. We need a better understanding, even within our department in some ways, on what does this mean, and how do we need to view our priorities, our work in this context. So we are working to roll out sort of new training and guidance to our internal staff, so there's an understanding of what the declaration means and how it needs to be considered in all our work. This of course will take some commitment and capacity to do, but we are committed to doing and starting to roll that out now. So training tools and such that we are working to roll out throughout the department is sort of a key next step for us. And as I mentioned earlier, I think, in terms of our own reconciliation, strategy that was put in place in 2019, that the opportunity to kind of refresh that to align with what we're hearing coming out of this engagement process, and to align with the declaration itself. And we do it is in a sense aligned, but we do see an opportunity to do more in that sense as well. So and that's not only, that can't be done just by DFO. We want to ensure that there's a process and opportunity for engagement, Indigenous input through that process. So that is another piece that we'll be working through as well. But again, I think I know again not a lot of specifics. We didn't want to come here with a message to say that this is here is the action plan. We need that to be, of course, informed by the current process, and then more work beyond that to ground actionable measures. So I think I'll stop there. I think we're just at time, and can turn back to the moderator. Thank you very much.
I use that to take liberty to actually put a question on the floor to you. So lots of talk about existing legislation, but what about new legislation that's being drafted, such as the Aquaculture Act? Where does that fit into this new plan development? Nice language. Either of you?
Yeah, sure. I can start. I mean, so the work that's being done within our Aboriginal Law Center on Section 5 and the alignment of federal laws with the Declaration, will obviously encompass new laws, new acts that need to be aligned with the Declaration. So anything new coming forward needs to go through a process of alignment. So right now, the work has really been more, what is that process of alignment and how do you develop it together? So that's really been the focus, but wanting to ensure that by June 2023, there's something very much more concrete in place to ensure that, so that the final action plan has something that is very clearly outlines how that's done. So we are working with all federal departments. I think, I mentioned an ADM committee, all of, different committees, but I think the mandate letters really help us have a hook on ensuring that federal departments are aware of their obligations with regard to Bill C-15 and the United Nations Declaration. So that is helpful as well.
Luke, do you want to answer, or is that sufficient? I'm going to take that that's sufficient. One of the things that I'm going to say, again, taking liberty, the province too has a goal to have plan and actual measures of engagement and implementation of DRIPA for the province of British Columbia. So please, federal government, do not overload our First Nations with third quarter engagement strategies. With that, take a 15-minute break and we'll be back at 2:45.